Our next speaker is Rebecca Blum. She's a researcher now at Lyft, but her personal research on death in the digital age has attracted speaking engagement at South by Southwest Interactive, San Francisco Design Week, and Endwell. She taught designing for death at the Stanford D School this winter. She holds an MBA from the Yale School of Management. She has published VentureBeat, Fast Company, Business Insider. She was an associate strategy director at Frog and currently is a senior researcher at Lyft. She's going to talk about NecroTech, death and legacy in the digital age. Welcome, Rebecca.
I know he's dead, but I can sign you up to something that helps. It will let you speak to him. And don't worry, you won't even have to do anything. I'll just assign... Shut up! You click the link, and you talk to it. It mimics him. And reads through all the things they've ever said online. The more it has, the more it's him.
So, how am I sounding?
You sound just like him.
This might sound a bit creepy. There's another level to this available. It's starting already. Don't put the boundary on.
So how many people have seen this episode of Black Mirror? Yes, okay. I figured the Venn diagram of IxDA attendees and Black Mirror watchers was probably just a circle. But for anyone that hasn't seen this, as you saw, a woman who suddenly loses her husband learns of a service that allows her to speak with his voice, call a version of him on the phone, and because it's Black Mirror, it obviously gets creepier from there. But I think what's most provocative about this is that the technology underlying it, most of it is already here. So the technology is radically shifting the relationship we have between life and death, and I think it will continue to do so even more in the future. And as someone who is interested in researching and designing experiences, for the most part, for everyday life, I'm also interested in how we think about designing not just for a product life cycle, but a human life cycle. And thinking about the fact that everyone in this room, not to be morbid, has one thing in common: we're going to die, and we need to design for that. But I started thinking about this topic not based on a dystopian Black Mirror episode, but after a very cozy coffee shop conversation with a friend of mine who was catching me up on her life a few years ago. She said she had a new man in her life. She was very excited. They're now engaged. They met on Hinge, and they met through a mutual friend. And the only difference between this story and every other meet-cute online story is that the friend that connected them had already passed away. So they were connected through a virtual ghost on Hinge. And she told me this story, and my reaction is kind of your faces. It's like, oh, what does that mean? And I started asking other people, have you had experiences like this, sort of uncanny moments? Maybe you were declared dead on Facebook accidentally, you're very much alive. Maybe someone who is dead tweeted from the grave. And I heard these stories. Has anyone had an experience like this? Just a few? In 3 years, everyone's hand is going to be up. We're starting to bring these moments in which the digital technology can't quite distinguish between life and afterlife. And this is important because we all want to have some sense of impact. We all want to know what we're leaving behind. And it's old news that we are living more and more of our lives digitally. So what does that mean as we think about legacy and the potential to leave something behind? This is my mom. She is a photographer in New York, and this is her doing what I think of as the most analog activity possible. She's literally pressing leaves in a magazine. And she probably uses her phone 1 hour a day to give me a call and then leave me a voicemail saying she called me and then text me to ask me if I heard her voicemail, right? The phone, so digitally, digital life is not a big part of how she creates her own presence out in the world. And then there's my niece, who here is taking her first selfie at age 2. We know this, right? We're living our lives more and more online, but what does that mean for what we leave behind? And how do we think about designing experiences that allow us to leave something behind that's meaningful? Ray Bradbury has this quote that I love. Or he says, everyone must leave something behind when he dies. A child, or a book, or a painting, or a garden planted. It doesn't matter what you do, so long as you change something from the way it was before you touched it into something that's like you after you take your hands away. Which I think is also a great description of design, right? We all want to leave something behind, whether it's the words we write, the designs we create, the DNA we pass on. And what does that mean if we're planting less and posting more? What do those digital gardens look like? Big tech companies are starting to think about this, but honestly, each one has their own approach, and there's aspects of it that are clunky in every case. Just one example, no offense to all of the Googlers out there, Google has a policy called the inactive account manager, which is, I think, an amazing euphemism for we think you're probably dead. Here's our policy, we're not quite sure. And every company is approaching this differently. Startups are also trying to offer people ways to seek comfort, to mourn, and potentially live on digitally. This is a Japanese company that lets you see augmented reality videos from those that have passed away. Do you want to hear grandma and grandpa talk to you in AR versions of themselves at a cemetery? Of course you do. How many people find this creepy? Yeah. Well, their promotional video says, "Don't worry, we're always watching you." So now I definitely feel reassured. And I think there's an added layer of creepiness when you look at the website, which has about 5 centimeters between the graveyard use edition and the daily usage edition. So what happens when AR grandma and grandpa pop up in the parking lot accidentally? Right? Talking about this need for seams, I think this is an example where we need to create more seams, not fewer, between experiences designed for digital life and designed for mourning and digital afterlife. Another example which shows one way we might be more thoughtful about this. This is Eva Schloss. She's one of the few remaining Holocaust survivors. Here she is being filmed by 116 cameras so that they can create a hologram version of her and use natural language processing so that school children in 2050 can ask her about her experiences in the Holocaust. How many people find this creepy? No. What about comforting or potentially meaningful? Yeah, very different reaction. And I think part of the reason is that we're being intentional about what context this appears in. There's more of a seam. She's not going to suddenly pop up in the parking lot to talk to you about the Holocaust. Last example, this is a woman who lost her friend. They used to text every day. She worked at an AI startup, and so rather than mourning in the way we might traditionally think about it, she decided to bring a version of him back. She created, her friend was named Roman, a Roman bot, and she texted with him every day. She asked him for advice. She said he gave very good advice. He misspelled similar words. And for her, she found this comforting. I think we need to think about what this means as we seek comfort and try to avoid the creepy as designers and as humans. And this is just the beginning. Imagine you want to talk to grandma, but grandma's passed away. So you text grandma bot. You're texting with grandma bot. She's giving you life advice as always, but you want to see grandma. And so you go, you sit on the bench where you always used to talk to grandma, and using augmented reality, you can see AR grandma, and you talk to her. And she asks you why you're not married yet, hypothetically, and you have the same types of conversations with grandma that you'd always used to have. This will be possible very soon. This is just the beginning, but it's not the first time that technology has radically impacted the way we relate to death. And I want to just end by talking about what I call NecroTech, which is how technology impacts, I see you cringing, I'm excited about that face. It's how technology impacts our relationship to death. And we can go back in time and see other examples of this dramatic shift. When we have a new type of technology, we also have a shifted relationship to death. One example, the telegram. allowing people to communicate across vast distances. Also coincides with the rise of seances, where people are suddenly communicating across vast figurative distances between life and afterlife. I'll show photography. Suddenly we're freezing life midair, coinciding with the rise of something called bereavement photography in the Victorian age, all the rage, where people would pose those who were living next to those that were not. And this is one of my favorite / least favorite photos, because one of these twins was alive when the photo was taken, and one of them was not. Creepy? Yeah. Comforting in the moment? Maybe. And here we are today doing something very similar, putting these experiences, juxtaposing digital life and digital afterlife in the same screen, bringing us closer to that Black Mirror vision. And people feel mixed about this, right? Ray Kurzweil, very excited about the idea of living on through some of these technological possibilities. Others are less excited. But wherever you fall on this spectrum of this will be comforting, this will be creepy, I think it's worth thinking about how we as designers can help others find comfort in these moments. How do we dial down the creepy and dial up the comfort? And I just want to end with one of my favorite poets, Philip Larkin, who was curmudgeonly throughout his life, but wrote this at the end. He said, "At death you break up. The bits that were you start speeding away from each other forever with no one to see." He wrote this never thinking that the bits that were you might actually be bits, and that instead of speeding away forever, they might actually remain and text back and potentially live on. Thank you.